Right now, somewhere in your body there is ancient DNA that doesn't fully belong to modern humans. Not Neanderthal, not Homo erectus, not any species you learned about in school. It belongs to a group of people so mysterious that scientists didn't even know they existed until 2010. A group we've never fully seen, never reconstructed, never truly understood. And yet, if you have ancestry from certain parts of the world, there's a real chance you're carrying a piece of them inside you right now. They're called the Denisovans, and their story might be the strangest, most humbling discovery in the history of human evolution. Here's what makes this so extraordinary. Most ancient human species get discovered through fossils. Skulls, jawbones, leg bones. Scientists find something buried in the ground, describe what the creature looked like, give it a name, and build a story around it. That's how it's always worked. But the Denisovans were discovered almost entirely through DNA. We found them in the genome before we found them in the ground. A ghost species, hiding not in rock, but in the living bodies of millions of people alive today. The physical evidence is almost insultingly small. A finger bone, a few teeth, a partial jawbone found on the Tibetan plateau. That's essentially it. You could fit everything we physically have of the Denisovans into a sandwich bag. And yet, from those tiny fragments, scientists have extracted a complete genome, pieced together a rough picture of a population that ranged across enormous stretches of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, and discovered something that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. They didn't just vanish. They merged into us. It all started in a cave in Siberia. The Denisova Cave, tucked into the Altai Mountains of southern Russia, a place that had been used by shepherds for centuries, completely unremarkable to look at. In 2008, archaeologists digging inside found a fragment of bone from the tip of a child's finger. Tiny, almost discarded. But when scientists in Leipzig ran the DNA, the results were unlike anything they had ever seen. Not modern human, not Neanderthal, something else entirely, something new. A small bone had just rewritten human history. And from that moment, the questions started piling up faster than the answers. Who exactly were these people? What did they look like? Were they truly a separate species or something more complicated than that label suggests? How did they live? What tools did they make? Did they have culture? Did they have language? Why did they disappear around 50,000 years ago, right when modern humans were spreading across Asia? And maybe most strangely of all, if they vanished, why do people in Papua New Guinea carry up to 6% of their DNA? Why do Tibetans carry a Denisovan gene that lets them breathe at high altitude, a gene that might literally be saving lives right now? This video is going to try to answer all of that. We're going to go through the evidence carefully, including what's solid, what's debated, and what scientists are still genuinely arguing about in journals right now. There will be surprises. There are some claims floating around about Denisovans that sound incredible, but don't quite hold up, and we're going to get into those too. Before we go anywhere though, I want to know where you're watching this from and what time it is there. Drop it in the comments. I actually read them, and it's always wild. Someone in Manila at midnight, someone in Toronto making coffee. All of us, descendants of ghost species trying to understand where we came from. Let's start at the beginning. With a cave, and a bone, and a discovery nobody saw coming, the Altai Mountains sit in a part of the world that doesn't get much attention. Southern Siberia, where Russia bleeds into Mongolia and Kazakhstan and China, a vast corrugated landscape of ridgelines and river valleys that has been cold and remote for as long as humans have been keeping records. It's not the kind of place you'd expect to be the centre of anything. And yet, carved into a limestone cliff above the Anhui River, there is a cave that has turned out to be one of the most important archaeological sites on the planet. Denisova Cave, named after a hermit monk named Denis, who reportedly lived there in the 18th century. 3 chambers, roughly 270 square meters of floor space, a steady internal temperature just above freezing. And that last detail matters more than you might think. Cold, stable temperatures are a DNA preservation system. The cave has been acting like a natural freezer for hundreds of thousands of years, locking ancient genetic material inside bones and sediments that would have degraded completely in a warmer climate. Archaeologists have known about the site since the 1970s. Soviet researchers began excavating it and found stone tools, animal bones, layers of cultural material going back through the Pleistocene. It was clearly important. What nobody suspected was how important, or what was hiding in the smallest fragments of bone that kept turning up in the dig. In 2008, during routine excavation of the Eastern Gallery, a team found a fragment of bone roughly the size of a fingernail. It was from the tip of a pinky finger, almost certainly from a child, and it was so small and so unassuming that under different circumstances it might have been documented and set aside. Instead, it made its way to the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, where a team led by Svante Pääbo had been developing something unprecedented: the ability to sequence ancient DNA with enough accuracy and depth to actually trust the results. What they found when they ran the genome stopped them cold. The mitochondrial DNA, the kind inherited only through the maternal line, was like nothing they had seen before. It wasn't modern human, it wasn't Neanderthal. The divergence from both lineages was too deep, too systematic to be contamination or error. Whatever this child had been, it wasn't anything currently in the catalogue of known human relatives. And here's the thing that made this discovery genuinely unlike anything that had come before. Normally, when scientists identify a new species in the fossil record, the anatomy comes first. Someone finds a skull, describes the shape of the brow ridge, the volume of the brain case, the structure of the teeth. The story is built from the outside in, physical features first, genetic analysis much later if at all. With the Denisovans, that entire sequence was reversed. The genome came first. Scientists knew this was a distinct lineage before they had any real idea what these people looked like. They were identified through their DNA, essentially invisible in the conventional anatomical sense, a population reconstructed from the inside out. A second molar found at the same site, enormous by modern human standards, provided more genetic material and confirmed the initial results. The nuclear genome, sequenced shortly after, showed that this lineage had diverged from the Neanderthal line somewhere around 400,000 years ago, long enough to accumulate significant genetic differences, but not so long that the boundary between species becomes clean or simple. They were related to Neanderthals in roughly the same way that a distant cousin is related to you, recognizably family, but distinct. The skepticism came quickly, and it was reasonable. A single tiny bone from a single site is a thin foundation for a species-level claim. Critics raised the obvious questions. Could the DNA have been contaminated? Could this be an unusual individual from a known population rather than evidence of something genuinely new? Could the mitochondrial signal be misleading about the larger picture? These weren't fringe objections. They were exactly the kind of scrutiny the claim deserved. What silenced most of the doubts wasn't a single counter-argument. It was accumulation. Additional samples from the same cave produced consistent results. The nuclear genome analysis, which draws on billions of base pairs rather than the relatively small mitochondrial genome, held up under repeated independent analysis. And then came the detail that transformed the discovery from contested to confirmed. Other research teams, working independently, began finding the same genetic signal in modern populations. People living in Papua New Guinea, in the Philippines, in Aboriginal Australia, carrying stretches of DNA that matched the Denisovan genome. Not similar. Matching. The signal wasn't just in Siberia. It was everywhere. Millions of people were walking around with Denisovan ancestry written into their cells, and nobody had known to look for it because nobody had known the Denisovans existed. That realization did something important to the broader field of paleoanthropology. It raised a question that nobody could easily dismiss. If an entire human lineage could remain completely invisible to science until 2010, what else were we missing? The traditional approach, finding fossils, describing anatomy, mapping migration based on physical remains, had been producing what felt like a fairly complete picture of human evolution. The Denisovan discovery suggested the picture had serious gaps, not because the fossils weren't there, but because without the DNA nobody knew what they were looking at. Bones that had been sitting in museum drawers for decades suddenly became suspects. Sites that had produced puzzling stone tools with no obvious maker suddenly had a candidate. The hunt for Denisovans in the fossil record had begun, and it would turn out to be far stranger and more complicated than anyone expected. So now you know the origin story: a fingernail-sized bone, a genome nobody recognized, and a lineage that had been hiding inside millions of living people without anyone noticing. But before we go any further, we need to slow down and ask a question that sounds simple, but absolutely isn't. What exactly is a Denisovan? Because the honest answer is, scientists are still working that out, and the reason it's complicated tells you something important about how human evolution actually worked, versus how we tend to talk about it. Start with the word species. In everyday language, species feels like a clean category. Dogs are one thing, wolves are another, and the line between them is obvious. But in deep human prehistory, that clarity dissolves almost completely. The classic definition of a biological species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. By that standard, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and modern humans probably weren't fully separate species at all. We know they interbred. We know the offspring survived and reproduced because their descendants are alive today. The DNA doesn't lie about that. What paleoanthropologists are really dealing with isn't a tidy branching tree of species. It's more like a river delta. Channel splitting, reconnecting, splitting again. Populations diverging long enough to develop distinct traits, then meeting again and exchanging genes, then drifting apart once more. The Denisovans fit somewhere in that messy middle ground, distinct enough to be recognizable, connected enough to have merged back into other lineages at multiple points. Some researchers prefer to call them a population rather than a species. Others use the word lineage. Some use archaic human. The terminology varies partly by preference, and partly because no single word captures the reality accurately. What's agreed upon is that there was a real, genetically coherent group of humans, separate enough from both Neanderthals and modern humans to be treated as a distinct branch of the family, and that branch lasted for hundreds of thousands of years. Now, how do scientists actually know any of this? That brings us to the DNA work itself, which is more painstaking than most people realize. Extracting ancient DNA is not like running a standard genetic test. Bone that has been sitting in cold sediment for 50,000 or 100,000 years is chemically degraded. The DNA inside it is broken into tiny fragments, chemically modified in specific ways, and heavily contaminated with genetic material from bacteria, fungi, and the modern humans who excavated and handled the samples. The contamination problem alone took years of methodological development to address seriously. The key tool is authentication. When ancient DNA degrades, it leaves a signature. The ends of fragments accumulate specific chemical changes, particularly a modification called cytosine deamination, which shows up in predictable patterns. If your sequenced fragments show those damage patterns in the right distribution, that's evidence the DNA is genuinely ancient. If it looks too clean, too intact, that's a red flag for modern contamination. Researchers also use multiple contamination controls, sequencing the DNA of everyone who handled the sample, running blank extractions, cross-referencing results across independent laboratories. The Denisovan results were validated through exactly this kind of rigorous checking, which is why the initial skepticism gradually gave way to broad acceptance. Identifying Denisovan ancestry in modern genomes is a separate but related challenge. The basic method is comparison. Researchers take the sequenced Denisovan genome from Denisova Cave and use it as a reference. When they look at modern human genomes, they search for long stretches of DNA that more closely resemble the Denisovan reference than they resemble other modern human sequences. The logic is that if your genome contains a block of sequence that looks Denisovan, and that block is too large to be explained by chance, or by shared ancient ancestry with everyone else, then it probably got there through interbreeding with Denisovans somewhere in your ancestry. The signal is clearest in populations from Papua New Guinea, Aboriginal Australia, island Southeast Asia, and the Philippines, some of whom carry around 4 to 6% Denisovan ancestry. That's a meaningful fraction. It's not a trace, it's a contribution. Which raises the question of why the fossil record is so thin. Fossils require a very specific set of conditions. The organism has to die in a place where minerals can replace organic material before it decomposes. Then those minerals have to survive geological upheaval, erosion, and millions of years of change. Then someone has to find the result and recognize it for what it is. The genetic signal, by contrast, gets copied and copied and copied with every generation. It persists because biology keeps duplicating it, so it's entirely possible for a population to be common enough to interbreed with and leave a detectable genetic footprint in millions of modern people, while leaving behind almost no physical trace that archaeology can identify. The fossils are rare not necessarily because Denisovans were rare, but because fossilization is rare and because we've only recently known what to look for. and that's where the scientific caution comes in. What's widely accepted at this point? There was a genuine archaic human lineage, separate from Neanderthals and modern humans, that lived across parts of Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, interbred with both other lineages on multiple occasions, and contributed real genetic material to populations alive today. That much has been replicated and confirmed enough times to be considered solid. What's still debated is almost everything else. How many distinct Denisovan populations were there? The genetic evidence hints at significant internal diversity, possibly multiple subgroups as different from each other as different human populations are today. Were all the puzzling fossil specimens turning up across Asia actually Denisovans, or were some of them something else entirely? How did their diversity map onto geography? And were there Denisovan populations that never interbred with anyone, leaving no genetic descendants at all, populations that simply went extinct without a trace? Those questions don't have settled answers yet, and the uncomfortable truth is that some of them may never be fully resolved. Because the Denisovans are, in a very real sense, a species we know mostly by its absence, defined by what isn't modern human, reconstructed from fragments, still partially hidden inside us. The more you look, the more complicated the picture gets, and we're just getting started. To understand the Denisovans, you can't just imagine cavemen in some generic prehistoric wilderness. You have to picture a world that looked nothing like the modern map. A world where coastlines shifted by hundreds of kilometers, forests marched back and forth across continents, and whole ecosystems appeared and vanished within the span of a few thousand years. The backdrop for their story is the Ice Age, not one endless blizzard, but a repeating cycle. Glacials and interglacials, cold phases and warmer phases, pulsing like a planetary heartbeat every 100,000 years or so. When the ice advanced, massive glaciers locked up water in the polar caps. Sea levels dropped, sometimes by more than 100 meters. Land bridges emerged. Siberia connected more firmly to the Arctic shelf. Japan edged closer to the mainland, and Southeast Asia transformed. What is now a scattered archipelago of islands, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, became part of a giant exposed landmass called Sunda. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania fused into another super-island called Sahul. Between them, chains of smaller islands formed stepping stones that humans could use to move, slowly, across a mostly continuous landscape. When the ice retreated, the reverse happened. Seas rose, drowning coastal plains, cutting off peninsulas, flooding river valleys. Forests expanded northward, grasslands shrank, wetlands formed where tundra had been. For Denisovans and their neighbours, this didn't happen overnight, but it did happen within the timescale of traditions, myths and migration memories. Generations could literally watch their world change. Asia, in this context, wasn't just the East. It was an entire planet's worth of environment stacked on one continent. In the far north, cold steppe, boreal forest, and icy rivers slicing through what we now call Siberia. Winters long and brutal. Summers short but bursting with insects, fish, and grazing herds. South of that, endless belts of temperate forest and grassland stretching across what is now Kazakhstan, Mongolia, northern China. Then further south still, monsoon forests, subtropical highlands, and tropical rainforests in Southeast Asia and southern China. Push east and you hit the coastal shelves that sometimes lay dry, exposing vast flat plains with rivers meandering across them like veins. Now drop ancient humans into this, not as tourists, but as residents. Denisovans, Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, all trying to make a living in a world that refused to sit still. This is where Asia's sheer size and ecological variety become crucial. In a small, uniform environment, one human population tends to blend into another. Genes mix, traits average out, and you get a relatively continuous, gradual gradient of variation. But in a continent as huge and patchy as Ice Age Asia, with deserts, mountains, rainforests and tundra all thrown together, that doesn't happen so smoothly. Instead, you get pockets. Some Denisovan groups hunt on cold, open steppes where mammoth woolly rhinoceros and steppe bison roam. Others live in river valleys lined with deciduous forest, tracking deer and boar under canopy. Others still cling to rugged mountainsides or high plateaus where the air is thin and winters cut like knives. A group that spends tens of thousands of years in the Tibetan plateau is exposed to very different selection pressures than a group living in the lowland rainforests of Southeast Asia. Over time, those pressures add up. The genetics reflect this. When researchers look closely at Denisovan-like DNA in modern people, they don't see one single signature. They see hints of multiple Denisovan lineages, cousin groups, diverging from a common ancestor and then evolving semi-independently. One flavour shows up more strongly in mainland Asia and Oceania, another in parts of East Asia, another in island populations. The implication is that the Denisovans weren't a single uniform population stretched thinly across the map. They were more like a family of related populations scattered through Asia's ecological maze. Asia's geography encouraged this fragmentation. Deserts like the Gobi and the Taklamakan acted as barriers, especially in colder, drier periods. Mountain ranges, the Himalaya, the Tian Shan, the Altai, channeled movement through narrow passes, isolating some groups and funneling others together. River systems like the Yangtze, the Yellow River, and the Mekong created rich corridors where populations could flourish, but they also separated people on opposite banks when floods were frequent and crossings dangerous. Now think about where these humans actually slept, stored their tools, told their stories. Caves, for one, were priceless real estate. Not every group lived in them permanently, but caves were anchor points on seasonal rounds, a dry, relatively stable microclimate. Shade in summer, warmth in winter, safe places to cache tools, bones, and perhaps even stories carved or painted on rock. Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains, where the first Denisovan DNA was found, was one such hub. But it wasn't uniquely Denisovan. Over tens of thousands of years, different human groups used it. Neanderthals were there. Early modern humans passed through. It was a crossroads as much as a home. Elsewhere, karst landscapes in China are riddled with caves and rock shelters, many of which have produced puzzling fossils that might be Denisovan, or might be some related archaic populations. In Southeast Asia, limestone caves overlook ancient floodplains and river valleys. These were perfect vantage points to monitor game movements, seasonal floods, and plant cycles. Caves also preserved bones and artifacts better than open sites, which is why our picture of Denisovans is biased toward these sheltered spaces. But they probably spent big chunks of their lives outside, in more exposed environments that left far fewer traces. River valleys were another critical element. In Ice Age Asia, rivers were lifelines. Even in cold or dry phases, river corridors kept running with meltwater from mountains and glaciers. Fish, waterfowl, reeds, and floodplain plants concentrated there. Herd animals followed the green ribbon of vegetation. Humans followed the herds. Denisovan groups in northern Asia would have used rivers like the Ob, the Yenisei, and the Lena as seasonal highways, moving up and down the valleys as resources shifted. Highlands, meanwhile, forced an entirely different set of strategies. Living above 3,000 or 4,000 meters isn't just a question of putting on more furs. The air itself changes. Oxygen is scarce, UV radiation is higher, weather is unpredictable. Yet genetic evidence shows that some Denisovan-related populations adapted to exactly these conditions. The famous EPAS1 variant in modern Tibetans, the one that helps them thrive at altitude without the chronic health problems that lowland people develop there, traces back to Denisovan ancestry. That implies Denisovans weren't just passing through the high plateau, at least some of them were long-term residents. They knew how to survive in a place where most humans would get sick and weak. Contrast that with the dense forests and mangroves of island Southeast Asia. There, visibility is low, large herd animals are rare, and most of the protein is in smaller, faster, more elusive packages: monkeys, birds, pigs, shellfish. The people who eventually spread their Denisovan DNA into populations of the Philippines, Indonesia, and New Guinea probably faced a very different resource mix, and may have developed different tools, hunting methods, and social patterns than their northern cousins. They may also have needed some form of water travel, because even during low sea levels, some island gaps, like the deep channels in Wallacea, never fully closed. All of this was happening while other humans were also moving around the same giant chessboard. Neanderthals, for a long time, were mostly a Western and Central Eurasian phenomenon, but their range reached eastward into Central Asia, and at sites like Denisova Cave they clearly overlapped in time and space with Denisovans. That overlap wasn't just theoretical. The genome of Denisova 11, a bone fragment from the cave, turned out to belong to a first-generation hybrid, a Denisovan father and a Neanderthal mother. Not a rare ancient rumour, a literal child of two different archaic lineages. Further south and later in time, early Homo sapiens began pushing out of Africa and into the same zones. By about 120,000 years ago, modern humans had made at least temporary forays into the Levant. By around 60,000 years ago, one of those expansions stuck. Our ancestors crossed into Arabia, followed coastal and inland routes eastward, and eventually encountered both Neanderthals and Denisovans along the way. In some places, probably in parts of Central and East Asia, 3 distinct human lineages may have overlapped within reachable distance of each other, each adapted to slightly different niches, but all close enough genetically to interbreed. So when we talk about Denisovan territory, we shouldn't imagine a neat block on the map labelled with a single colour that other humans politely stayed out of. It was more like a series of partially overlapping ranges, shifting in response to climate pulses, local extinctions and population expansions. In some glacial phases, Denisovan groups might have been pushed south into refuges in China or Southeast Asia, while Neanderthals dominated the colder west. In warmer phases, the distribution might have stretched north again into Siberia and the forest steppe. Early modern humans arrived late to this party, but when they did, they stepped into a landscape that had already been negotiated, contested, and shared by other humans for hundreds of thousands of years. And that brings us to one of the biggest unsolved questions in this whole story. How far did Denisovans really spread? We have confirmed Denisovan DNA from a handful of fossils in Siberia and the Tibetan Plateau. We have Denisovan-like genetic signals in living people from mainland Asia, the Pacific and island Southeast Asia. We have mysterious fossils from China, Laos, the Philippines, and Indonesia that some researchers argue could be Denisovan or closely related populations. Put those lines of evidence together and one picture emerges. Denisovans, or Denisovan-like humans, may have ranged from subarctic Siberia all the way to tropical Southeast Asia, maybe even contributing genes to the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans as they moved towards Sahul. But that's still an inference chained together from scattered clues. Different teams disagree on which fossils to call Denisovan. Some suggest multiple archaic lineages in Asia, only some of which were Denisovan in the narrow genetic sense. Others argue for a broader Denisovan complex of related populations. The farther you move from the Siberian reference genome, the fuzzier the labels become. What everyone agrees on is that Ice Age Asia was not empty, not simple, and not homogeneous. It was a patchwork: caves and plateaus, rivers and coasts, refuges and corridors. In that patchwork, Denisovans carved out their own spaces, sometimes alone, sometimes shoulder to shoulder with Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens, sometimes leaving descendants, sometimes disappearing without a trace. To get any closer to them, to move beyond the map and the climate graphs, we have to ask an even more intimate question. What were these people actually like? What did their bodies look like? How did they move? How big were they really? Because buried inside all this talk of habitats and DNA is a more visceral mystery. The rumour that the Denisovans might have been giants. That's where we're headed next. So let's deal with it head on. Were Denisovans actually giants? If you've seen headlines or thumbnail titles about a giant human species, it sounds like we're talking about 9-foot titans stomping through Ice Age Asia. That makes for good clicks, but the evidence just is a lot more modest and a lot stranger. Start with what we physically have. For a species that seems to have covered half a continent and left DNA all over modern populations, the confirmed Denisovan fossil collection is almost comically small. From Denisova Cave in Siberia, a finger bone fragment, a few teeth, a scrap of long bone from a limb, and the hybrid girl, Denisova 11, whose bone shard turned out to belong to a half Neanderthal, half Denisovan child. From the Tibetan Plateau, a partial lower jaw, the Siahi mandible, found in Bashir Karst Cave and later identified as Denisovan through ancient proteins preserved in the bone. That's basically it in the 100% definitely Denisovan category. And yet, even from that tiny set, two things jump out. The teeth are big, and the jaw is massive. The Denisovan molars from Denisova Cave are noticeably larger than those of most Neanderthals and modern humans. Not just a little wider, these are chunky blocks of enamel and dentine with robust roots and thick crowns, sitting toward the upper end of what we've seen in the genus Homo for the last few 100,000 years. The Siahi jaw is the same story. It's wide, it's thick. The bone is deep from the tooth row down to the base of the mandible. The area where chewing muscles attached is heavily built. It looks like it belonged to someone who could put serious force into each bite. That's where the giant narrative starts. People see big teeth, a beefy jaw, and think, okay, this must have been a very large person, maybe a whole species of them. Add that to the fact that some Denisovan and mixed modern populations, like certain highland groups or Pacific Islanders, include tall, strongly built individuals, and it's tempting to draw a straight line. Big ancient bones, big modern bodies, boom, giants. But that's not how anatomy works. Big teeth can mean several things. Yes, they often correlate with a robust build. Heavier jaws and stronger chewing muscles usually go with thicker limb bones and a generally stockier skeleton. That's the pattern you see in Neanderthals. Big faces, big teeth, big bodies. But tooth and jaw size are also shaped by diet, development, and evolutionary history. If you're frequently chewing tough meat, fibrous plants, or gritty foods full of dust and sand, you need durable teeth. If your group's ancestors have been doing that for hundreds of thousands of years, natural selection may favour larger tooth crowns, thicker enamel, and more robust jaws to spread out the forces and reduce breakage. In other words, big chewing apparatus doesn't automatically equal towering height. It can also be an adaptation to what you eat and how early and hard you use your teeth as tools, ripping, crushing, processing plants, softening leather, even holding things while your hands work. We also have to remember that tooth size shrank over time in our lineage. Earlier Homo species often had larger teeth relative to body size than modern humans, so Denisovan dental proportions might partly reflect them holding onto an older, more archaic pattern longer than we did, rather than evolving into something freakishly huge. So were Denisovans big-bodied? Probably robust, yes. Giants? That's a stretch. Here's what the cautious reconstruction looks like. If you compare Denisovan genetic data to what we know about body-size genes in modern humans and Neanderthals, there are hints that Denisovans sat in the same general range as other Ice Age Eurasians. Not wildly taller, but likely stocky, muscular, with strong bones and powerful upper bodies. Add the Siahi jaw and the Denisova teeth to that picture, and a reasonable guess is that many Denisovans were built on the rugby-forward end of the human spectrum. Solid, heavy, good at retaining heat and handling physical strain. In cold steppe or high-altitude environments, that kind of body is an advantage. It's the same reason Neanderthals evolved barrel chests and thick limbs. Less surface area to lose heat, more muscle to generate it. But here's the frustrating part. We can't put a number on it. We don't have a complete Denisovan femur, or a full set of long bones where you can look at joint surfaces and shaft length and say, okay, average male, this tall, this heavy. We have fragments and genetics and good analogies from related species, and that's it. So where do the more specific claims come from? The diagrams online showing towering Denisovans looming over modern humans. Some of it is pure speculation. Some of it is a game of telephone from older hominin finds like Gigantopithecus, a giant ape from Asia that really was huge, but went extinct long before Denisovans evolved and wasn't human in the first place. And some of it comes from a newer line of research that tries to squeeze phenotype, physical traits, out of ancient DNA. In the last few years, scientists have started using genetic and epigenetic clues to reconstruct what extinct humans might have looked like. DNA doesn't just code for proteins, it also carries patterns of chemical tags, methyl groups, that influence which genes are turned on or off in different tissues. Those patterns can sometimes be reconstructed from ancient DNA. If you know, for example, that certain methylation signatures are associated with stronger cartilage growth in modern people, and you see a similar pattern in Neanderthal DNA, you can tentatively infer that Neanderthals had particular cartilage-related traits. One team did this with Denisovan DNA and tried to predict aspects of their anatomy: skull shape, pelvic dimensions, limb proportions, even facial features. Their results suggested Denisovans might have had a broad, projecting face, somewhat like Neanderthals, but with their own twists. Wider dental arches, big jaws, thick rib cages, generally robust bodies. It's clever work. It's also extremely indirect. Those methods depend on several layers of assumption. That the relationship between methylation and anatomy is the same in Denisovans as in modern humans. That the reconstructions of ancient methylation are accurate. that complex traits really can be teased out one gene or regulatory region at a time. Most researchers see these models as interesting hypotheses, not settled facts. So when you see a super detailed Denisovan face render or a scientific height estimate derived from DNA, it's worth mentally labeling it as plausible sketch, not official portrait. What we can say with more confidence is about function, not exact form. The Denisovans who lived in Siberia and on the Tibetan plateau almost certainly carried cold-adapted and high-altitude adapted traits, robust bodies to conserve heat, perhaps deep chests to help with breathing thin air, metabolic tweaks to handle low oxygen. The EPAS one gene variant passed from Denisovans into modern Tibetans doesn't change height, but it changes how blood and tissues respond to altitude stress. For Denisovans in tropical Southeast Asia, the picture might have been different. A heavily insulated, polar bear-like build is actually a disadvantage there. In hot, humid environments, slimmer bodies, with more surface area to shed heat, work better. That's what we see in many modern tropical populations. Given how genetically diverse and geographically spread the Denisovan-like lineages seem to have been, there may not have been a single Denisovan body. Northern groups could have skewed shorter and stockier, southern groups lighter and leaner, highland groups somewhere in between but with specialized cardiorespiratory traits. Just as modern humans come in many shapes and sizes adapted to local climates, Denisovans probably did too. The big teeth and jaws, though, might have been widespread. That chewing apparatus could be a shared ancestral feature carried across multiple Denisovan populations, layered on top of region-specific adaptations in height, limb proportions, and body mass. And this meshes with another line of evidence: wear patterns. On Denisovan molars, the wear is heavy but orderly, consistent with a lifetime of serious chewing. The enamel is thick, suggesting an evolutionary investment in durability. Some researchers think this points to a diet that was tough and mechanically demanding: jerked or dried meat, roots and tubers, unprocessed seeds and nuts, maybe even bone processing to extract marrow. All of that fits a robust jaw better than a delicate one. What about their faces? Neanderthals had big mid-faces, strong brow ridges and long low skulls. Early modern humans had more rounded skulls and flatter faces. Where do Denisovans sit on that spectrum? Based on the jaw and genetic inferences, they probably weren't delicate. A safe middle ground reconstruction would give them a broad face, powerful jaw muscles, and a skull shape closer to Neanderthals than to us, but not identical. Think archaic human with its own regional flair, not movie monster. And that brings us back to the giant question from a different angle. To us, gracile, relatively lightly built modern humans used to climate control and soft diets, almost any archaic Eurasian hominin would feel giant. A 5'7" Neanderthal with that much muscle and bone mass would be extremely imposing in person. A Denisovan built on similar lines would be no different. In a direct encounter, giant might be exactly how they felt to our ancestors, even if the tape measure didn't show an NBA roster. So the honest summary looks like this. Denisovans were almost certainly robust. Some groups probably had stocky, cold-adapted bodies. Their teeth and jaws were large and powerful, adapted to hard use. Genetic and epigenetic evidence hints at sturdy skeletons and strong faces. But we have no proof they were dramatically taller than other humans, and no reason to think they were mythological giants. What we do have is a mystery, a physically formidable, genetically influential human lineage that we can't yet picture clearly because the bones are missing. And that mystery matters, because how you move through the world, how your body is built, shapes everything else. How far you can migrate, what you can hunt, what kind of tools you favour, how you build shelter, how you organise daily life. To get closer to the Denisovans as people, we have to move from skeletons and genes to behaviour. What did these robust Ice Age humans actually do with those jaws and muscles? What were their tools like? Their fires, their shelters, their day-to-day routines? That's where we're going next. Here's the first big headache in trying to reconstruct Denisovan daily life. Most of the places where Denisovan bones or DNA show up were not Denisovan-only Airbnb rentals. They were crowded. Denisova Cave in Siberia, Baishia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau, a handful of other candidate sites across Asia. They're more like Grand Central Station than a family home. Different human groups used them at different times. Neanderthals, Denisovans, early modern humans, maybe even older hominins all passing through, leaving stone tools, butchered bones, hearths, and the occasional tooth or finger fragment. Tens of thousands of artifacts, a few scraps of actual people. And that's the archaeology problem. When you pull a stone blade out of a layer that also has Denisovan DNA in the sediments, it's tempting to say, a Denisovan knife. But what if a Neanderthal group used the cave a few centuries earlier, left their tools, and then Denisovans moved in later and shed some skin cells into the same disturbed sediments? Or the other way around? Sediments get mixed. Caves flood. Animals dig burrows. Later visitors scrape floors flat, build new hearths on top of old ones, and drag older material back to the surface. Over tens of thousands of years, a nice clean sequence of this species here, that species there, can turn into a layer cake that's been through a blender. So when we ask, what were Denisovan tools like? How did they hunt? What kind of shelters did they build? We're often forced to do it with two unreliable guides, who else we know was in the neighbourhood, and how the tools themselves look. Let's start with Denisova Cave itself, because that's still ground zero. The cave has a long, complex stratigraphy, layers going back hundreds of thousands of years. In the levels dated roughly between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, we find Middle Paleolithic stone tools, flakes, points, scrapers, not crude, but not the hyper-refined blades of later Upper Paleolithic humans either. Animal bones with clear-cut marks, reindeer, horse, bison, cave bear, big game. Hearths, patches of reddened sediment, charcoal, burned bone, evidence of repeated fire use. Ornaments and worked pieces, later on, tiny pendants made of animal teeth, a polished greenstone bracelet, drilled bones. Mixed into this archaeological stew we have genetic snapshots. Sediment DNA and bone fragments tell us that Neanderthals occupied the cave at some times, Denisovans at others, and at least once, a child with a Neanderthal mother and a Denisovan father lived and died there. The layers where Denisovan DNA peaks aren't always neatly separated from Neanderthal layers, they grade into each other. So whose tools are we looking at? One school of thought says, broadly, the Middle Paleolithic style assemblages, simple flakes, Levallois-type prepared cores, scrapers, could be either Neanderthal or Denisovan. Both species knew and used these techniques. There's nothing in that basic toolkit that screams this is uniquely Denisovan. Another argument is more cautious. Without a Denisovan bone directly associated with a particular hearth or tool cluster, we should really label these industries as non-specific hominin, meaning some Ice Age human did this, we just don't know which one. That's not a very satisfying answer if you're trying to imagine Denisovan day-to-day life, but it's the honest one. Tool styles by themselves are lousy ID cards. Archaeologists love to name industries: Mousterian, Mikokian, Châtelperronian, Initial Upper Paleolithic, and then map them to species. Mousterian equals Neanderthal, Upper Paleolithic equals modern humans, and so on. Reality is messier. The same basic stoneworking ideas can spread between groups through cultural contact. One species can copy the tools of another. Two separate groups facing similar problems can independently invent similar solutions. And when modern humans show up late in the story, they move fast and mix with local populations, leaving hybrid toolkits behind. So instead of asking what were Denisovan tools like, in the singular it's safer to ask, given when and where Denisovans lived, what kinds of technologies were available to them, and what does that imply about their daily routines? Across Ice Age Northern Asia in their time window we see sophisticated core preparation to knock off multiple useful flakes, points that could be hafted onto wooden shafts as thrusting spears or possibly light throwing spears, scrapers and denticulated, toothed, tools for hideworking and woodworking, occasional bone tools, though much rarer than stone, increasing signs of planning in raw material transport. Good quality stone carried tens of kilometres. Denisovans were almost certainly part of this technological world. Whether they invented particular variants or adopted them from neighbours, they were living in a landscape where stoneworking was already a complex learned craft. That craft feeds straight into how you get food. Let's talk hunting. In the wider regions where Denisovan-like DNA later shows up, Siberia, northern China, the Tibetan Plateau, Southeast Asia, we see broadly similar Ice Age hunting strategies, mixed game, flexible tactics. In the north, reindeer, wild horse, bison, woolly rhinoceros, mammoth in some places plus smaller game like hares and birds. On the plateau, yak, wild sheep and goat, antelope-like animals, marmots. In lower latitudes, deer, pigs, monkeys, forest ungulates, plus more year-round plant resources and fish. Bones at Denisova Cave and nearby sites show systematic butchery. Long bones split for marrow, meat carefully stripped, different body parts brought back to camp. This looks like coordinated hunting parties, not scavengers picking at carnivore leftovers. The likely Denisovan pattern is similar to Neanderthals and early modern humans in Eurasia, small groups fanning out from a temporary camp, using the terrain, gullies, riverbanks, snowdrifts to funnel animals, finishing with close-range spear thrusts or coordinated drives. That's dangerous work. It fits a robust, muscular body plan well. It also demands detailed knowledge of animal migration routes and seasonal timing. Which brings us to movement and shelter. How did Denisovans deal with seasons in places where winter is not a minor inconvenience, but a yearly attempt on your life? Caves like Denisova and Baishia were probably keynotes in a larger seasonal circuit. They're not cosy permanent villages, but they are reliable sheltered spots you can come back to at certain times of year. Lambing season, salmon runs, migrations through a nearby valley. You use the cave as a base camp, repair tools, process carcasses, ride out bad storms, and then range out in a radius of tens of kilometres to hunt and gather. In between, you almost certainly have open-air camps, windbreaks of wood and bone, temporary tent-like structures, maybe snow houses or brush shelters, most of which leave almost no trace after tens of thousands of years. In Siberia and on the Tibetan plateau, winter camping without good shelter is a death sentence. So even if we don't see neat circular post holes and preserved huts in Denisovan layers, physics alone tells us they must have been building something. Frameworks of wood or antler, covered with hides sewn together, banked with earth, snow or brush for insulation. That implies another piece of daily life, clothing. Neanderthal sites give us strong indirect evidence for tailored clothing. Specialized hide scrapers, small bone tools that look like needles or awls, and the simple fact that you do not survive Ice Age Europe in a single fur cape thrown over your shoulders. In Denisovan-occupied regions it's similar. At high altitudes, wind chill is brutal. Even in summer, nights bite. We don't yet have a Denisovan bone needle we can point to, but the toolkit types we do see, scrapers with heavy hide-working wear, fine retouched blades that could cut and trim soft material, fit a world where soft-fitted clothing exists. Think multiple layers of tanned hides, fur turned inward for warmth, wrapped foot coverings with extra padding from grass or moss, maybe even regionally different outfits, heavier parkas in Siberia, lighter wraps and capes in Southeast Asia. Fire ties all of this together. At Denisova Cave and other Pleistocene sites in Central Asia, there's unambiguous evidence of repeated hearth construction. Burned bone and stone fractured by high heat. Charcoal from different kinds of wood, suggesting selective fuel use. This isn't, we occasionally got lucky with a lightning strike. This is routine, controlled fire. For Denisovans, fire would have been warmth, obviously, light in dark caves, a predator deterrent at night, a way to cook meat and roots, making calories easier to digest. A tool for landscape management, encouraging certain plants, clearing underbrush. In places like the Tibetan plateau, fire is also a way to cheat altitude a little. Boiling water for safety, cooking grains or roots, drying meat for transport. Modern high-altitude herders still depend on it. There's no reason to think Denisovans didn't. What we're left with, when you put all of this together, is a sketch of daily life that's familiar if you know Ice Age Eurasia, but still maddeningly blurred around the edges. Small mobile bands, seasonal rounds between known resource hotspots, complex stoneworking, probably taught from elders to children over years, skilled hunting with close-range weapons, hide-working clothing, shelters adapted to serious cold in some regions, fire at the centre of camp life, cooking, warmth, storytelling space, and above all, flexibility. Remember, Denisovan-like lineages show up genetically from Siberia to New Guinea. No single daily routine fits that entire range. Northern Denisovans may have lived very differently from tropical island Denisovans. Boat builders on a Southeast Asian coast are not doing the same things as high-altitude yak hunters in winter. That geographical spread is actually the clue that matters most. It tells us Denisovans weren't just tough bodies. They were culturally adaptable, able to learn new local resources, tweak their hunting strategies, modify shelters and clothing as they moved into new environments. And that raises the next, deeper question. To sustain that level of flexibility, not just within one lifetime, but across many generations, how much mental infrastructure do you need? How rich do your traditions have to be? How sophisticated your communication? Do you need symbols, teaching rituals, shared stories? In other words, were Denisovans just practical survivors with good tools and fire, or were they also doing something more? Art, ornaments, abstract marks, maybe even myths. The problem is, once again, that crowded cave. Some of the most spectacular objects from Denisova Cave, a polished greenstone bracelet, tiny tooth pendants, drilled bones, come from layers that also contain Denisovan DNA. For years, many scientists cautiously labelled them probably made by modern humans. More recent work has pushed some of those artefacts back in time, into periods when Neanderthals or Denisovans seem more likely occupants. That reopens the possibility that Denisovans weren't just camping and butchering there. They may have been making jewellery, shaping stone for beauty as well as function, participating in symbolic behaviour. But may have is doing a lot of work. To decide how far we can go, we have to look much more closely at those objects, at the dating and at parallel finds across Asia. We have to ask, is there such a thing as a Denisovan style of ornament or art? Or are we seeing a shared symbolic world of multiple human species? That's where we're headed next. Let's go back to that crowded cave. Down in the Denisova deposits, mixed with butchered bones and burned hearths, we don't just find tools, we find objects that are extra, things that are more work than they need to be, things that carry no obvious survival payoff, things that look suspiciously like meaning. One of the most famous is that greenstone bracelet. It's made of chloratolite, a hard, attractive green rock. Someone chose a particularly beautiful piece then, shaped it into a smooth, curved band, polished it to a near-mirror finish, drilled a tiny hole with such precision that modern researchers suspect it required a rotating tool. Under a microscope, you can see fine polishing striations, signs of deliberate finishing. This wasn't a 5-minute trinket whipped up between hunts. It's hours and hours of focused work, and it's fragile, thick enough to wear but not some indestructible utilitarian bracelet you'd take on a mammoth hunt. It looks like something you'd wear for display, for status, maybe for ritual. In the same general stratigraphic package we get pendants made from animal teeth, carefully perforated so they could be strung. Slender, smoothed bone fragments that might be decorative or used as part of composite objects. Pieces of ostrich eggshell and other exotic materials that had to be carried in from far away. Add that up and it sure smells like symbolic behaviour. Jewellery, personal ornaments, objects that say something about who you are. So, Denisovan art? Here's the catch. Those ornaments don't come with name tags. The layers that yielded the bracelet and many of the pendants at Denisova Cave span a long time window, roughly from about 50,000 to maybe 100,000 years ago, depending on the specific object and the dating method. In that same margin of error, we have genetic evidence for Neanderthals, for Denisovans, and possibly for early modern humans in the broader region. And the cave floor has been used, reused, scraped, dug into and rearranged for tens of thousands of years. So when archaeologists dig down and pull out that bracelet fragment from a particular sediment lens, they can date the surrounding material with radiocarbon or optically stimulated luminescence and say, this layer is roughly X thousand years old. They can then compare that with the DNA signal from that layer and say, around this time, Denisovan DNA is present, or Neanderthal DNA spikes here. But sediment DNA is finicky. It can move, water percolates, burrowing animals churn. Later, humans dig pits or hearths, dragging older material up and younger material down. Even a single misplaced stone flake can complicate the picture. So you end up with a set of overlapping, slightly fuzzy signals. Ornament A dates to roughly this window. Denisovan DNA, abundant in roughly this overlapping window. Neanderthal DNA, also present but maybe peaking slightly earlier or later. Early modern humans, perhaps in the wider region, not clearly in this exact layer. Now you have to decide, how comfortable are you saying Denisovans made this? Some researchers lean in and say, If Denisovan DNA dominates the cave's human signal at that time, and we don't yet have clear evidence that modern humans were camping there, then Denisovans are the best candidate. They see the bracelet and pendants as part of a Denisovan cultural repertoire. Others slam on the brakes. They argue that the dating uncertainties are too big. A few thousand years of wiggle room is more than enough time for occupants to change. Tool styles in those layers resemble what early modern humans use elsewhere in Asia, suggesting a sapiens presence that just hasn't left clear skeletal remains yet. Symbolic artifacts in other parts of Eurasia are more securely tied to modern humans, so by default, they'd attribute similarly sophisticated pieces here to sapiens unless proven otherwise. In that cautious view, the safest label for the bracelet is made by some Upper Paleolithic capable hominin, species uncertain. It's a buzzkill, but it's methodologically clean. This kind of tug-of-war isn't limited to Denisova Cave. Beishia Karst Cave on the Tibetan Plateau, where the famous Denisovan jawbone turned up, also has stone tools and evidence of fire use. Some sediments there contain Denisovan DNA that's surprisingly young, maybe as recent as 45,000 to 30,000 years ago. But ornaments, clear art, not yet. If they're there, we haven't found them, or we haven't recognized them. So right now, Denisova Cave is still the main stage for the did Denisovans do symbolic stuff debate. To make sense of that debate, we have to zoom out and ask a more basic question. What does symbolic behavior even mean? When anthropologists use that term, they're not just talking about pretty objects. They're talking about actions and things that stand for something else in a shared way. A pendant that marks you as part of a group. Red pigment dabbed on a corpse to signal ritual or belief. Abstract marks scored into bone or rock that might record a count, a season, a story. It's not enough that an object is unusual. A weirdly shaped stone can just be an accident. It's the pattern, the repetition, the standardized style, the context, that tells you you're looking at symbols, not random noise. Why does this matter? Because symbolic behavior is tied to a whole suite of mental capacities, abstract thought, the ability to let one thing stand for another. Shared conventions, group agreements about what colours, shapes, or objects mean. Long-term social memory, traditions that persist across generations. It's the difference between I made this because it's sharp and I made this because it shows I belong, I mourn, I believe. Now, compare Denisovan adjacent evidence with what we see from their cousins, Neanderthals first. For a long time, textbooks basically said, Neanderthals, good hunters, no real art. Then the evidence pile started to grow. We now have intentional burials at sites like Shanidar and La Chapelle-aux-Sung, where bodies were placed carefully, sometimes in pits, sometimes with grave goods like animal bones or tools. Personal ornaments in late Neanderthal contexts in Europe. Pierced animal teeth, shells with traces of pigment, eagle talons shaped and smoothed, likely hung as pendants. Use of pigments, lumps of ochre and manganese dioxide, sometimes in quantities that suggest more than just utilitarian use. Possible cave markings and constructions like the ring of broken stalagmites at Bruniquel Cave in France, far back in the darkness, dated to around 175,000 years ago, long before modern humans show up in Europe. Some of these finds are still hotly debated, but the overall picture has shifted. Neanderthals were not symbol-free brutes. They participated in some kind of symbolic world, though maybe not as explosively as later Homo sapiens, now early modern humans. By around 100,000 to 70,000 years ago in Africa and later in Eurasia, the evidence for symbolic behavior tied to sapiens is overwhelming. Shell beads at sites like Blombos and School/Guafze. Engraved ochre with cross-hatched patterns that look like deliberate abstract designs. Long-distance transport of rare stones and shells, suggesting they mattered as symbols, not just as tools. Later on, figurative art, animal paintings, hybrid human-animal figures, carved female figurines, by 45,000 to 35,000 years ago across Europe and parts of Asia. Against that backdrop, Denisovan-linked ornaments sit in a grey zone. They're not out of step with what Neanderthals and early sapiens were doing. If anything, they fit right in. A polished stone bracelet, tooth pendants. That's the same basic symbolic toolkit you find among Upper Paleolithic humans all over Eurasia. What's missing is a clean association. We don't have a Denisovan skeleton in a grave with a bracelet around its wrist and a pendant on its chest. We don't have cave walls with figures in a style unique to Denisova layers and nowhere else. We don't have a cluster of ornaments made only during time windows when Neanderthals and modern humans are clearly absent. So researchers slice the evidence in different ways. One camp says, given Denisovans' wide geographic range, their genetic sophistication, and the fact that their neighbours, Neanderthals and sapiens, had symbolic culture, it would be surprising if Denisovans didn't. They treat the Denisova ornaments as at least plausible Denisovan culture. Another camp says, plausible isn't proof. Until we have a tighter link, bones and beads together, or a Denisovan-only site with clear ornaments, we should keep the attribution open. Notice what almost nobody serious is arguing anymore, that Denisovans were mentally primitive. Their DNA shows complex adaptation to harsh environments and high altitudes. Their geographic spread implies long-distance movement, and probably some kind of social networking. Their presence in island Southeast Asia hints at seafaring and planning. All of that requires brains and culture on par with other late Pleistocene humans. The real question isn't, were Denisovans capable of symbolic thought? It's, can we catch them in the act? Because once you grant them ornaments, once you imagine Denisovan people choosing colours, polishing stones simply because it's beautiful, marking their bodies and clothing in group-specific ways, the picture of their society shifts. You're not just looking at rugged foragers surviving in the cold. You're looking at clans with names and taboos, stories told around fires about ancestors and spirits in the mountains, alliances sealed with gifts of rare green stone brought from a distant valley. That kind of culture does something strange to time. It lets knowledge and identity accumulate across generations. It allows groups to coordinate on large scales, to remember who wronged whom, who helped in a famine, who has a marriage tie 2 valleys away. It's also the kind of culture that makes disappearance harder to explain. If Denisovans had ornaments, symbols, myths, if they were participating in the same symbolic revolution as Neanderthals and early sapiens, then why don't they persist as a recognizable group? Why do we see their genes echoing in modern Tibetans, Papuans, Filipinos, and indigenous Australians, but no community today that can say, we are Denisovans, the way some populations can trace cultural continuity to ancient Neanderthal territories or early sapien sites? Did they get out-competed? Absorbed? Did their symbols and stories get folded into ours, renamed, repurposed, forgotten? Or are we simply missing the archaeological sites that would show us a distinct Denisovan style, a different way of being human that ran parallel to ours for hundreds of thousands of years before fading as populations mixed? Those are not questions we can answer yet. What we can say is this. By the time modern humans start moving into Denisovan territory, around 60,000 years ago, the moment we'll get to soon, we're not walking into an empty stage. We're entering landscapes already thick with human meaning. Caves that have seen multiple species make fire and perhaps bury their dead. Valleys where ornaments may already carry stories. And into that symbolic web, our ancestors didn't just wander. They married into it. They had children with Denisovans. They carried Denisovan genes and maybe Denisovan ideas forward. Which brings us to the next part of the story. What actually happened when our lineage and theirs met face to face on those Ice Age frontiers? When geneticists talk about Denisovans today, they don't start with bones. They start with ghosts, not spooky bedsheet ghosts. Genetic ghosts, little stretches of DNA in living people that don't match any known modern human pattern and don't match Neanderthals either. Those odd segments are how Denisovans were discovered in the first place. And they're also how we know, with a high degree of confidence, that Denisovans weren't just neighbours to other humans. They were lovers, spouses, parents. So let's unpack what that actually means. When two populations that have been evolving separately for a while meet and have children, their genes mix. Biologists call this admixture. It's just a clinical word for something deeply personal. Two people from different groups having a child and that child carrying a mosaic of both ancestries. Genetically, admixture leaves fingerprints. Imagine lining up two genomes side by side, letter by letter. If they've been separated for hundreds of thousands of years, whole stretches will be subtly but consistently different. Different spellings in the same long text. Now imagine a child whose parents come from those two diverged populations. Their genome will be a patchwork, a chunk that looks clearly parent A, then a chunk that looks clearly parent B, back and forth across all 23 chromosomes. Over generations, recombination, shuffling during sex, chops those big chunks into smaller and smaller pieces. A few thousand years later, you don't get massive blocks from one source. You get lots of shorter segments scattered everywhere. But they're still distinctive enough that, with powerful computational tools, you can say, this particular run of DNA doesn't look like typical modern human. It clusters with this ancient genome over here. That's how Denisovan ancestry is detected. Researchers take high-quality genomes from Neanderthal bones, high-quality genomes from Denisovan remains, like that famous finger bone and a few other fragments. Lots of genomes from living humans around the world. Then they scan for segments in modern people that match Denisovans more closely than they match Neanderthals or any living population. Those are the Denisovan ghosts, and they don't all look the same. That turns out to be crucial. If there had been just one brief encounter, say, a single Denisovan sapiens contact zone that produced a few hybrid kids, you'd expect Denisovan segments in all descendant populations to have roughly the same statistical flavour. The same kind of divergence from modern human DNA, the same general structure. That's not what we see. Instead, geneticists find at least 2, maybe 3 distinct Denisovan-like signatures in living people. Some match the Denisovan genome from Siberia pretty well. Others are different enough that they must have come from Denisovan populations we haven't even sampled directly yet. Ghosts of ghosts. That's the first big clue. Denisovan admixture wasn't a single night in one lonely valley, it was a pattern. Multiple populations, multiple meetings, spread out across tens of thousands of years, and it wasn't only with us. Inside Denisova Cave, in those same deep layers where ornaments and tools turn up, scientists pulled DNA from a bone fragment so small it was almost thrown away. When they sequenced it, the result was startling. Half of its genome looked Neanderthal, half looked Denisovan. Not metaphorically, literally half and half. This wasn't some distant hybrid descendant 10 generations down the line. This was a first-generation child, one parent Neanderthal, one parent Denisovan. They nicknamed her Deni. Deni's existence collapses a lot of abstract debate into a single unavoidable fact. Neanderthals and Denisovans didn't just share continents or alternate cave occupancy like timeshare owners. At least sometimes, they lived close enough, long enough, peacefully enough that individuals formed relationships, had sex and raised children together. And Deni is probably not some weird one-off accident. Statistically, the odds of us just happening to find the remains of the only Neanderthal Denisovan hybrid ever born are microscopic. The more reasonable interpretation is mixed ancestry individuals were a repeating feature of life wherever these populations overlapped. Other Denisovan bones from the cave show hints of this too. Some Denisovans there carry bits of Neanderthal ancestry from earlier admixture events. That means there wasn't just one Neanderthal-Denisovan meeting, there were waves of contact, maybe different valleys, different centuries, different social arrangements. But the gene flow went both ways, and it happened more than once. Now add Homo sapiens to the mix. By about 60,000 years ago, some groups of modern humans were leaving Africa, making their way along the Arabian coasts, up into the Levant, across into Central and South Asia, eventually reaching Southeast Asia and Australia. On paper you might imagine a straightforward replacement scenario. Newcomers arrive, old populations vanish, curtain. But the genomes tell a messier, more human story. Pretty much all non-African populations today carry around 1 to 2% Neanderthal ancestry. That alone is a sign of interbreeding between our lineage and theirs, probably in the Middle East and parts of Eurasia shortly after we left Africa. In some populations, especially in island Southeast Asia, Papua New Guinea, parts of Australia, parts of the Philippines, there's an extra layer. Up to 3 to 5% of their genome can be traced back to Denisovans. Those Denisovan segments are not the same as the Neanderthal ones. They have different patterns, cluster differently, and in some cases show clear ties to Denisovan-like lineages that are genetically distant from the Siberian Denisovans we've sampled. That tells us modern humans met Denisovans at least twice in different regions. Those Denisovans weren't all one homogeneous group, they were diverse, spread across Asia. Our ancestors didn't just fight them, they integrated them, at least partially, into their communities. Genetic modelling suggests an early admixture event somewhere in mainland Asia, where the ancestors of East Asians and Oceanians picked up a northern Denisovan signal. Later, separate admixture events further south or east. where the ancestors of Papuans and some Philippine indigenous groups picked up southern Denisovan ancestry from populations that might have been living in island Southeast Asia. Think about what this implies on the ground. Interbreeding isn't something you can do from a distance. For genes to flow, bodies have to share space. That means zones of overlap, shared river valleys, neighbouring winter camps, hunting territories that weren't strictly segregated. It means situations where people exchange not just genes, but information about animals, plants, weather. Children grew up hearing two slightly different styles of speech, learning two traditions of tool use, inheriting stories from both sides. Social rules existed to manage who could marry whom, how outsider partners were integrated, what counted as kin. None of that shows up directly in the fossil record, but it's what admixture implies when you translate the dry term into lived reality. It also means the idea of three human species as clean, separate branches is more of a tidy textbook diagram than an accurate portrait. Yes, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans had distinct evolutionary histories and some anatomical and genetic differences. Yes, if you sampled them at their extremes, you could probably tell which was which. But at the frontiers, in the places where their ranges kissed and overlapped, the lines blurred. Picture a valley in Central Asia 70,000 years ago. In one direction, a cluster of Denisovan camps along the lower slopes, close to the best winter grazing for herbivores. In another, Neanderthal groups occupying cave mouths with good vantage points over the plains. Somewhere downriver, small bands of incoming Homo sapiens, following coastlines and rivers, moving into new country. On some days, these groups might avoid each other. On others, they'd meet at a carcass, or at a flint outcrop, or along a migration route they both depended on. Sometimes those encounters probably ended badly. Three different lineages, each optimized for survival, are not going to spontaneously form a utopian coalition. There were likely conflicts, raids, maybe even local extinctions, but other times they apparently ended in something else. Trade, temporary alliances, and occasionally family. Because that's what a hybrid child is, not a category on a chart. A person. Someone who had a Denisovan grandparent telling them about spirits in the mountains, and a Neanderthal grandparent teaching them how to stalk reindeer through the snow. Or a young woman with mostly sapiens ancestry and a Denisovan father carrying a mixture of genes that made her better at high-altitude living than either side of her family alone. Her children, and their children, carry those advantages onward, down the millennia, all the way into modern Tibetan villages. When you zoom in like that, admixture stops being a technical term and becomes a set of very specific lives. We don't know their names, we don't know their languages, but we can say there were communities where a pure label stopped making sense. There were bands where every face carried a slightly different ancestral mix, and that was just normal. There were probably debates, tensions, and negotiations about who counted as us and who counted as them, just as there are in human societies today. And remember, all of this is happening against the backdrop we talked about earlier. A world still recovering from ancient climate trauma, still unpredictable, still dangerous. In that world, any connection that helped you survive, a partner from another group with different seasonal knowledge, a child with a novel combination of resilience genes, could be the difference between your lineage thriving and vanishing. That's why these hybrid histories matter. They're not just curiosities. They're the mechanism by which useful Denisovan traits spread into our lineage. Altitude adaptation, pathogen resistance, maybe even subtle brain or metabolism tweaks we're only starting to understand. We'll get to those in detail later. For now, focus on the human angle. By the time Denisovans disappear as a distinct group in the fossil record, they've already succeeded in a different way. They've woven themselves into other people's genealogies, into Neanderthals in Siberia, into sapiens in mainland Asia, into the ancestors of Papuans, Aboriginal Australians, and Highland Asians whose genomes still carry Denisovan signatures today. Every Denisovan segment in a modern genome is a tiny historical document. It says, at some point in some valley or on some coastline, two people from different human worlds stood close enough to touch and decided not to walk away. In the next section, we'll follow those ghostly signatures more closely. Where exactly does Denisovan DNA show up today? Why is it dense in some places and almost absent in others? And what can that patchy map tell us about the last chapters of Denisovan history? If you could see Denisovan ancestry on a world map, it wouldn't be a smooth, even haze. It would look more like scattered bonfires, bright in some regions, faint embers in others, entire continents where the glow is so dim it's hard to see anything at all. Let's start with the brightest flames. Today, the strongest Denisovan signal shows up in parts of Oceania and island Southeast Asia. Populations in Papua New Guinea, parts of the Bismarck Archipelago, some indigenous Australians and several indigenous groups in the Philippines carry the highest known levels of Denisovan-related DNA, often in the range of 3 to 5%, sometimes even a bit more depending on the method used. That might not sound like much, but in human evolutionary terms, it's enormous. Remember, most non-African populations carry around 1 to 2% Neanderthal ancestry. Having twice that amount from Denisovans means their ancestors had more intense or repeated contact with Denisovan-like groups, and that a lot of those foreign segments survived the genetic lottery of time. East Asia shows a different pattern. Many East Asian populations, Han Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, some Southeast Asian groups, carry a detectable but lower level of Denisovan ancestry. It's usually less than what you see in Papuans or indigenous Australians, but it's still there, peeking out from behind the Neanderthal component. If you follow that faint Denisovan trail northward and westward, it gets even weaker. Some South Asian populations carry traces. Some Native American groups may carry very faint echoes that came along with their East Asian ancestors across Beringia. In Europe and most of Western Asia, Denisovan ancestry is nearly or completely absent, at least at our current resolution. Africa, interestingly, is almost entirely free of Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA in the strict sense. There are a few hints of back migration, people who left Africa, mixed with other groups, and then came back. But for the most part, sub-Saharan African genomes don't show the same archaic admixture patterns seen elsewhere. They have their own deep, complex histories with other ancient African lineages instead. So why this patchy, lopsided map? Because what you're actually looking at is not where Denisovans lived, but where Denisovan DNA survived. Those are not the same thing. Denisovans probably ranged across huge swathes of Asia, from Siberia down into Southeast Asia. But the genetic signal we see today is the end product of where they overlapped with our ancestors. How many hybrid children were born? How big the human populations were that carried that ancestry forward? And what happened in all the tens of thousands of years after those first encounters? This is where history and population math collide. Imagine an early wave of modern humans moving through mainland Asia, maybe 50 to 60,000 years ago. Somewhere, Central Asia, perhaps northern Southeast Asia, they meet a Denisovan-like group. A few generations of interbreeding happen. Their descendants carry, say, 5 or 10% Denisovan ancestry. Now picture what happens next. Those descendants don't just stand still. Some branch off and head toward what is now East Asia. Others keep going, following coasts and islands into what will become New Guinea and Australia. Along the way, their population gets repeatedly chopped into smaller groups, bottlenecked on islands, isolated in mountain valleys. In small populations, genetic drift, random fluctuations in which genes get passed on, can have an outsized effect. You can lose big chunks of ancestry just by chance, but you can also keep unusual variants at higher frequencies just because there aren't many people to dilute them. That's one reason Papuan and Aboriginal Australian groups ended up with such high Denisovan percentages. Their ancestors carried Denisovan DNA into regions that later stayed relatively isolated, geographically and demographically. Fewer incoming waves to wash that signal away. Meanwhile, back on the mainland, the story is different. Asia didn't stay static. After those early waves, there were later expansions, new populations from other parts of Eurasia, repeated migrations out of central regions, massive demographic events tied to the spread of agriculture and later civilizations. Each of those waves is like pouring fresh water into a cup of dyed liquid. The more you pour, the paler the original colour becomes. That's one big reason Denisovan ancestry is lower in East Asia than in Oceania. It's not that East Asians' ancestors didn't meet Denisovans, the DNA says they did. It's that later population growth and mixing diluted that Denisovan signal over and over again. By the time you reach Europe, you're dealing with populations whose ancestors may have had little or no direct contact with Denisovans at all. Their archaic admixture comes overwhelmingly from Neanderthals. Any Denisovan segments that might have snuck in through long chains of interbreeding are now so faint and broken up that they're hard to distinguish from background noise. So the map is not a static picture. It's the visible residue of countless demographic turnovers, expansions, bottlenecks, and contacts. Now there's an added twist. The Denisovan DNA in Oceania is not quite the same as the Denisovan DNA in East Asia. When researchers compare those segments to the genome from Denisova Cave, they see something striking. Some admixture blocks, especially in East Asians, look fairly close to that Siberian Denisovan profile. But the segments in Papuans and related groups are often more distantly related, so different that they seem to come from a Denisovan lineage that had been separated from the Siberian Denisovans for hundreds of thousands of years. In other words, there isn't just one Denisovan ghost in our genomes. There are at least two, maybe three, hinting at different Denisovan populations spread across Asia. A northern branch, related to the Denisovans we've sampled in Siberia. A more divergent southern branch, likely living somewhere in Southeast Asia and the islands beyond. And possibly additional sublineages we haven't untangled yet. That's why geneticists sometimes talk about Denisovan-like ancestry, instead of just Denisovan. It's a placeholder word for a broader, diverse family of archaic populations that we've only glimpsed through a few fossils and a lot of statistical shadows. To visualize it, imagine you only had one Neanderthal genome from Spain, and you tried to use it as a stand-in for every Neanderthal who ever lived from France to Siberia. You'd get the broad strokes right, but you'd miss all kinds of regional variation. The same thing is almost certainly true for Denisovans. Now let's tackle a common confusion. What does it mean to say a living person has 5% Denisovan ancestry? It does not mean that 5% of their ancestors were literally Denisovan individuals lined up in a family tree, like 1 out of 20 great-great times 15 grandparents. Genetic ancestry isn't genealogical bookkeeping. It's about how much of your DNA sequence is more similar to one reference population than another. Think of your genome as a vast book of 3 billion letters. Over hundreds of thousands of years, different human groups accumulate slightly different spellings in that book. When we say someone has 5% Denisovan ancestry, we mean that about 5% of their genetic text clearly clusters with Denisovan versions of those spellings, rather than with typical modern human or Neanderthal ones. Because of recombination, the reshuffling of DNA every generation, the specific Denisovan chunks you inherit are random. Two people with 3% Denisovan ancestry might share almost none of the same Denisovan segments. The percentage is an average over the whole genome, not a list of specific Denisovan relatives. There's another subtlety, that 3 or 5% is what's left after tens of thousands of years of weeding out. The first hybrid children would have carried much more Denisovan DNA, half, if one parent was fully Denisovan. Over time, most of those archaic segments were lost at random, or selected against because they didn't work well in new environments. What remains today is a survivorship-biased sample, the bits that didn't hurt, and in some cases actually helped. This leads to a second misunderstanding. The idea that a small percentage equals small importance. It doesn't work that way. Some genes affect almost nothing obvious. Others have huge impacts on things like altitude tolerance, immune response, or how your body handles fats and sugars. If even a tiny subset of Denisovan segments lands in those high-impact regions, they can shape whole populations' adaptation to new environments. We'll dive into specific examples in the next section, but the key idea is this. Most Denisovan DNA in us today is just neutral background, genetic noise drifting along for the ride. But a minority of segments were so useful in certain places that natural selection actively favoured them. Those pieces didn't just survive, they spread. And that's why it matters where Denisovan ancestry shows up. The high percentages in Oceania tell us those populations had deep and sustained contact with Denisovan-like groups, probably including lineages we haven't even sampled yet. The lower but still real levels in East Asia tell us there were earlier or more northern encounters too. The near absence in Europe and Africa tells us something else. Either contact there was minimal, or later demographic tides washed almost all traces away. Taken together, that patchy pattern gives us a rough outline of Denisovan's final centuries as a distinct people, where they likely held on longest, where they were absorbed, and where their descendants' are walking around today without realizing they carry fragments of an ancient Asian ghost. But as we just hinted, those fragments aren't all equal. Some did more than ride along in our genomes. They changed the odds of survival, especially in tough environments like high mountains, pathogen-rich tropics, or new climate zones. So the next question is not just, where is Denisovan DNA, but what is it doing there? Why did natural selection keep some of it and toss the rest? In the next section, we'll zoom in on those standout segments, the Denisovan genes that behave less like relics and more like upgrades, altitude superpowers, immune tweaks, and other trade-offs that show how an extinct human lineage is still helping shape our biology today. To understand what Denisovan DNA is doing in us, you have to flip how you think about evolution. We usually imagine it as a slow grind. Random mutations arise, most do nothing, a few help, and over thousands of generations natural selection nudges populations toward better adaptations. But when our ancestors walked into Denisovan territory, they stumbled on a shortcut. Instead of waiting for random mutations to appear, they could literally borrow solutions that another human lineage had already spent hundreds of thousands of years perfecting. Geneticists call this adaptive introgression. Introgression just means genes flowing from one population into another through interbreeding. Adaptive means some of those genes weren't just passengers, they actually helped. Think of it like this. You're a modern human group moving into a new landscape, a high plateau, a disease-heavy jungle, a cold northern forest. Your biology is tuned to the places your ancestors came from, not necessarily this new world. The Denisovans have been here much longer. They've already done the evolutionary trial and error, paid for in generations of failed mutations and dead ends. Their genomes contain hacked-together solutions to the problems this specific environment throws at you. When your people and their people have children together, those children don't just inherit a random blend of faces and body shapes. Hidden in their cells, they also inherit Denisovan tricks for coping with altitude, pathogens, diet, and climate. Most of those archaic segments will be neutral. Some will be harmful and quietly filtered out over time, but every once in a while one is a jackpot. The single best example we know of lives in the blood of people living on the roof of the world. High in the Himalayas, many Tibetans carry a special version of a gene called EPAS1. EPAS1 is part of the body's oxygen sensing system. When you go to high altitude, the air is thinner. Your tissues get less oxygen. In most people, EPAS1 helps trigger a low oxygen alarm. Your body responds by making more red blood cells to carry oxygen. That works in the short term, but push it too far and your blood turns into sludge. It gets thick and sticky. Your heart has to work harder. Risk of clots, strokes, pregnancy complications, all of that goes up. Now imagine living at 4,000 meters year-round. Most lowlanders can't. We get altitude sickness. We suffer. Our performance drops. Long-term health takes a hit. Tibetans on average don't. Their version of EPAS1 keeps the body from overreacting. It blunts that emergency red blood cell response. They still adjust to the altitude, but in a much more controlled way. Fewer side effects, less strain on the heart, fewer complications in pregnancy. Genetically, this EPAS1 variant is weird. It isn't just a slightly tweaked modern human sequence. It sits way off to the side in evolutionary space, far closer to Denisovan DNA than to any other human version we've seen. In other words, Tibetan high-altitude tolerance looks like a Denisovan gift. At some point tens of thousands of years ago, modern humans moving through Central or East Asia met Denisovan-like populations who had been living at altitude or in hypoxic environments for a very long time. They interbred. Hybrid children were born carrying Denisovan-style EPAS1. For most people at low elevations, it didn't matter much. The variant just drifted around. But for the subsets of those populations who pushed up into the Tibetan plateau, everything changed. Suddenly, if you had that Denisovan-like EPAS1, you didn't get as sick. You could carry pregnancies to term more safely. You could work, hunt, and move without your blood turning to jelly. You survived. Your kids survived. Your neighbors who didn't have it, they struggled more. Generation by generation, natural selection quietly boosted the frequency of that Denisovan segment, until in some Tibetan groups today it's nearly universal. This is adaptive introgression in action. Not a vague 3% archaic ancestry, but one specific ancient genetic tool reshaping what it means to be human in a particular place. EPAS1 isn't the only case. Sprinkled across Asian and Oceanian genomes are Denisovan-like variants involved in how our immune systems recognize and respond to pathogens. Some of them sit in gene families with ominous-sounding names like TLRs, toll-like receptors, which are part of the body's early warning system against bacteria and viruses. Others show up in genes involved in antiviral defense or inflammatory signaling. The logic is similar. When modern humans left Africa, they carried immune systems tuned to African ecosystems. They were stepping into landscapes full of unfamiliar parasites, viruses, and microbes. Denisovans had been there much longer. Their immune genes had already been stress-tested against local pathogen communities for hundreds of thousands of years. They had accumulated tweaks, some subtle, some drastic, that improved survival in those specific disease environments. Interbreeding turned them into a library our ancestors could access. If a Denisovan-derived immune variant helped hybrid children shrug off some local infection, maybe a high-altitude lung bug, maybe a waterborne parasite, maybe something entirely gone today, those kids were simply more likely to live long enough to have kids of their own. Over time, those helpful variants spread. We can see the fingerprints of this process in modern genomes. Certain Denisovan-like immune segments are found at higher frequencies than you'd expect from random drift alone. They bear the hallmarks of positive selection: hitchhiking patterns, long haplotypes, unusual frequency spikes in particular regions. But there's a catch. Evolution doesn't hand out free upgrades. Every adaptation is context-dependent. A gene that's a superpower in one environment can turn into a liability in another. Take those immune tweaks. Cranking up your immune reactivity might help you fight off a dangerous pathogen in a tropical jungle. But that same hair-trigger immune system might increase the risk of autoimmune disease or chronic inflammation in a cleaner, more urban environment where those ancient pathogens are rare. What was once life-saving can become overkill. The same logic applies to metabolism-related variants. There are hints that some Denisovan-derived alleles affect how our bodies handle fats, sugars, and even certain plant compounds. In a foraging or early farming lifestyle with periodic food shortages, those variants might have helped people squeeze more energy out of scarce or marginal foods. Drop that same genetic setup into a modern world of constant calorie abundance, and it might slightly tilt the odds toward obesity, insulin resistance, or cardiovascular disease. We don't have all the details yet. These associations are complex, and many proposed links are still being tested and debated. But the pattern that keeps emerging is this. Archaic DNA didn't just give us upgrades, it shifted trade-offs. EPAS1 again is a good example. At altitude, the Denisovan-like version is spectacular. It reduces the dangerous overproduction of red blood cells. It lowers the risk of altitude-related pregnancy disorders. It keeps your cardiovascular system from running in the red all the time. At sea level, though, that same dampening of the hypoxia response might not be ideal in every context. Under certain stresses, say acute lung disease or specific athletic demands, it could conceivably be neutral, slightly helpful, or slightly harmful depending on the rest of your genome and environment. Natural selection doesn't care about absolutes. It cares about averages over lifetimes in particular places. The Denisovan variants that stuck around are the ones that, on balance, helped more than they hurt in the environments where they spread. Once you see this, the patchwork of Denisovan ancestry stops looking like a ghost map and starts to look like a record of local problem-solving. High plateaus, borrowed oxygen management software. Pathogen-rich valleys and islands, borrowed immune tuning. New diets and plant ecologies, borrowed detox and metabolism tweaks. Each of these segments is a fossilized negotiation between our ancestors and the landscapes they tried to live in. There's another layer to this story. Adaptive introgression probably wasn't rare or unique to Denisovans. Neanderthal genes also contributed to our immunity, skin, and hair adaptations in Eurasia. Other, still unknown archaic lineages inside Africa almost certainly did something similar there. What makes Denisovans stand out is where and how their gifts show up. EPAS1 and a handful of other high-altitude-related genes are some of the clearest, most dramatic examples we have of any archaic DNA anywhere actually changing the boundaries of where humans can live. Without that Denisovan legacy, it's plausible that permanent large-scale settlement of the Tibetan plateau would have been far harder, maybe delayed, maybe limited to lower altitudes, and it doesn't stop with Tibet. Some high-altitude adaptations in other parts of the world, like the Andes or the Ethiopian highlands, seem to have evolved independently, mostly from modern human mutations. That contrast tells us something important. Borrowing Denisovan DNA wasn't the only path to solving altitude. It was just one path that happened to be available in Asia. Where Denisovans didn't live, humans had to grind their own evolutionary gears. Where Denisovans did live, we occasionally got to copy-paste. So when you hear 3% Denisovan ancestry, don't think of it as a faint, irrelevant smudge in your genetic background. Think of it as a few crucial chapters in a survival manual that our lineage didn't have to write from scratch. Denisovans are gone as a culture, as a language, as living communities with their own stories and memories. But fragments of their biology are still running inside millions of modern humans, doing quiet work, tuning blood, shaping immunity, nudging metabolism long after their last purebred descendants vanished. In that sense, they didn't just disappear. They were partially absorbed, their most useful solutions copied forward into our species. Their evolutionary experiments became part of our standard equipment. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If Denisovan genes helped us survive in some of the harshest environments on Earth, why aren't Denisovans themselves still here? How can a lineage be so successful that its DNA spreads across half a continent, yet its distinct people vanish from the archaeological record? To answer that, we have to leave the microscopic scale of genes and zoom back out to the big picture. Climate swings, population booms, competition, and a world where 3 human species were never going to coexist peacefully forever. That's where we're headed next. Let's start by untangling that phrase. Denisovans vanished 50,000 years ago. What does that actually mean? It does not mean that one day there were thriving Denisovan villages, and the next day, nothing. No footprints, no voices, lights out, credits roll. That 50,000 years figure is really a shorthand for something messier. If you look at the tiny handful of Denisovan fossils we have, and the DNA we've pulled out of them, they seem to cluster between roughly 200,000 and 50,000 years ago. If you look at genetic signals of Denisovan ancestry in living people, you can reconstruct when our ancestors last interbred with Denisovan-like populations. Those dates cluster roughly between about 200,000 and maybe as recently as 30,000 to 40,000 years ago, depending on the region and the model you use. If you look at archaeological layers in Denisova Cave itself, the clearly Denisovan-associated layers taper off by around 50,000 years ago, give or take. Different tools, different lines of evidence, slightly different clocks. So when someone says they vanished 50,000 years ago, they're really saying, by around this time, Denisovans as a distinct, easily recognizable lineage were fading out of the fossil and archaeological record in the places we've actually dug. But that doesn't necessarily mean that every last Denisovan individual on Earth died that year. They could have persisted in pockets. They could have retreated into refuges. They could have been gradually absorbed into bigger, more numerous populations. And that's where the story gets interesting. Because when you try to explain why Denisovans disappeared, you quickly realize that extinction, for a human lineage, doesn't have to mean what it means for mammoths or saber-toothed cats. It can mean something much stranger, being swallowed. Let's lay out the usual suspects first. 1. Climate. Denisovans evolved and spread during a time when the planet was whiplashing between cold glacial periods and warmer interglacials. Asia wasn't one stable backdrop, it was a constantly reshuffled stage. Ice sheets advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell by more than 100 meters. Forests turned into steppe turned into desert, coastlines appeared and vanished. Every one of those swings rearranged habitats. A valley that had been perfect Denisovan territory for 10,000 years could turn into a dry, game-poor wasteland over a few centuries. A coastal plain where they'd hunted shellfish and seabirds could drown under rising seas in the span of a few dozen generations. If you're a species with huge, dense populations scattered everywhere, you can ride that out. Some groups suffer, others thrive, the whole network adjusts. But Denisovans were probably never that numerous. All the genetic evidence we have suggests that archaic humans, Neanderthals and Denisovans alike, lived in relatively small fragmented populations. Think tens of thousands spread across enormous regions, not millions. That makes you vulnerable. If your population is already chopped up into tiny semi-isolated groups, 20 people here, 50 there, maybe a few hundred in a favoured basin, then a single bad run of climate, a prolonged drought, a shift in migration routes of the animals you depend on can wipe out one of those groups entirely. A metapopulation can handle a lot of local extinctions, but only up to a point. If too many groups wink out at once, the network collapses. Climate didn't just threaten Denisovans directly through cold or heat, it also changed the competitive landscape, which brings us to suspect number 2, competition. By around 60,000 years ago, modern humans were pouring out of Africa. By 45,000 to 50,000 years ago, they were already in Southeast Asia and Australia. In some regions, they seem to appear suddenly in the archaeological record with dense, widespread sites and rapidly changing toolkits. Neanderthals, meanwhile, still occupied parts of Western and Central Eurasia, sometimes flirting with Denisovan ranges, sometimes interbreeding with them. Denisovans had been playing this survival game across Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. But now the rules were shifting. Modern humans didn't just bring different faces and slightly different genes. They brought a different way of being social, bigger networks, faster information flow, more flexible technologies that could be recombined and repurposed quickly, possibly more complex language. In a world where the climate is jerking resources around like a yo-yo, that kind of flexibility is a superweapon. If your band can tap into knowledge from dozens of other bands about where herds are moving, which valleys are still wet, which plants are edible this year, you're going to outmaneuver a group whose networks are smaller and slower. You can show up in a valley during the good years, pull out a living more efficiently, then pivot somewhere else when things sour. From the Denisovan point of view, these newcomers might not have looked that different anatomically. But ecologically, they were a different kind of competitor. They could pack more people into the same territory. They could push into marginal environments. They could rebound from crashes faster. Over a few thousand years, that kind of advantage doesn't have to look like genocide. It can look like this. Every time there's a drought, a resource crash, or a disease wave, the modern human groups recover a little better. Their numbers creep up. They fill more valleys, occupy more coasts, intercept more migration routes. Denisovan groups, already small, find themselves squeezed into less and less ideal terrain. High mountains, deep forests, odd refuges on the edges of better lands. Some hold out for a while, some even thrive locally. But as centuries roll into millennia, the map tilts. That leads into suspect 3. Numbers. Small population size is a trap. When you don't have many individuals, random bad luck, what geneticists call drift, and what reality calls that time 3 key hunters all died in the same accident, hits you harder. Diseases spread more easily through a close-knit band. Inbreeding becomes more common. A run of a few bad birth years can permanently dent your numbers. And if you get hit with a combination of pressures, climate shifts plus new human neighbours, plus maybe a novel disease your immune system hasn't seen before, your margin for error disappears. We don't have clear evidence that modern humans brought new pathogens into Denisovan territory, the way Europeans brought smallpox into the Americas. That kind of detail is beyond what our data can currently show. But we can say this. Whenever two long-separated populations meet, microbes exchange too. Sometimes that's a one-way disaster. Sometimes it's a slow, grinding equalizer. Either way, in small, scattered communities, it's dangerous. So far, this sounds like a pretty standard extinction story. Climate rocks the boat. Competition rocks it more. Small numbers make it hard to stay afloat. But then there's suspect 4, and this is the one that really scrambles our intuition. Assimilation. Unlike mammoths or giant ground sloths, Denisovans didn't just die next to us. They slept with us. Those interbreeding events you heard about earlier weren't one-off accidents. The genetic evidence points to multiple episodes, in different times and places, involving different Denisovan-like populations. Each time, some number of hybrid children were born. Each time, a little bit of Denisovan genetic material flowed into a broader human network. Now imagine you're one of those small, stressed Denisovan bands on the margins of expanding modern human territory. Your winter was bad. Your numbers are low. A few of your young people start meeting, trading, and eventually pairing up with these strange but familiar newcomers. Their bands are bigger. Their toolkits are slightly different. They have access to useful things, new stone sources, coastal foods, distant gossip. You can easily tell a tragic version of this story. Denisovan women taken as mates into modern human bands, their original culture and language gradually smothered by the dominant group. But you can also tell a more ambiguous version. From inside those communities, it might have felt less like conquest and more like merging. As mixed children grow up, lines blur. Who counts as us? The answer shifts. Over a few hundred years, a Denisovan band might dissolve not because everyone died, but because everyone's grandchildren are now living in groups that call themselves something else, speak a somewhat different language, use slightly different tools, follow different leaders. To a future archaeologist, the distinct Denisovan signal fades from view. To a geneticist, it doesn't. It's right there, embedded in modern genomes. in segments that look Denisovan-like and sit under selection in specific environments. This is what extinction by absorption looks like. There is no last stand at a cave mouth, no final, pure population dying together. There is just a demographic slide where, generation by generation, it becomes less and less meaningful to talk about pure Denisovans at all. Their bodies disappear as a named group, their DNA does not. That helps explain another puzzle too. Why does the archaeological visibility of Denisovans seem to drop off a cliff in many regions right around the time modern humans show up? Even though genetic signals suggest Denisovan ancestry was still getting mixed in, part of it is bias. We've only excavated a microscopic fraction of the places Denisovans might have lived. Most of our knowledge comes from one Siberian cave and a few scattered sites and fossils. If late surviving Denisovan-like groups were pushed into more marginal terrains, steep mountains, dense forests, lowland swamps, those are exactly the kinds of places where preserving and finding archaeology is hardest. Caves are great time capsules, high, dry, stable. But caves are rare, and not every group lives in them. If your last refugees are rock overhangs that crumble, forests where organic remains rot fast, coastal plains that later drowned as sea levels rose, your material culture can vanish from our record even if you stuck around for thousands of extra years. The other part is cultural blending. Imagine a hybrid community in Southeast Asia 45,000 years ago. Some people have mostly Denisovan ancestry, some have mostly modern human ancestry, some are in between. They all use a similar mix of tools because they've been copying off each other for generations. If you walked into their campsite and picked up a scraper or a spear point, you wouldn't see a bright line. This is a Denisovan object. That is a modern human object. You'd just see a local tradition. From our vantage point tens of thousands of years later, that makes it almost impossible to draw clean archaeological boundaries. We end up labelling big chunks of late Pleistocene Asia as modern human, simply because the bones we can identify there are anatomically closer to us, and because our default assumption is that these fancy tools must have been ours. But what if some of those communities were already braided together? Part Denisovan, part us. In that case, Denisovans didn't totally disappear from those landscapes. They just stopped existing as a separate thing. Which brings us to the strangest part of this whole story. If Denisovans were once widespread across Asia, from Siberia to Indonesia, possibly with multiple distinct regional populations, if they survived long enough to pass on adaptive genes that are still influencing Tibetans, Filipinos, Papuans, indigenous Australians and others today, if they were close enough to us biologically that repeated interbreeding was possible, then why, in 2024, can we still count their confirmed fossils on our fingers? How can a lineage that left such a strong genetic echo be so eerily absent from the ground? That's the mystery hanging over Denisovan research right now. Either we've been walking past their bones without recognizing them, or their last hideouts were exactly the kinds of places that rot, drown and erase bones fastest. Or there are caches of Denisovan remains sitting in museum drawers today, mislabeled as early modern human, or odd Neanderthal, or unassigned archaic, waiting for someone to test the right fragment for ancient DNA or proteins. In other words, their vanishing act might not be complete. We've followed their trail from ghost DNA and living people back to a single Siberian cave and a scattering of clues. The next steps are going to require new tools, new digs, and a willingness to question what we thought we knew about who was living where and when. Because somewhere out there, maybe in a cave high on a Himalayan slope, maybe in a flooded shelf off the coast of Borneo, maybe in a dusty collection box in a regional museum, there are likely more Denisovan bones waiting. And every new bone has the potential to scramble this story all over again. So how do you chase a species that barely left any bones? You cheat. You stop waiting for perfect skeletons in perfect caves. You start listening to the dirt itself. Over the last decade, ancient DNA research has quietly flipped the rules. Originally, you needed a decent chunk of bone or tooth, preserved in cold, dry conditions, to have any hope of getting DNA. That's why Denisovans first turned up in Siberia, not in some steamy Southeast Asian jungle. Cold caves are basically natural freezers, but now, researchers can take a plastic tube of what looks like random cave dust, run it through a lab pipeline, and pull out traces of DNA from animals and humans that passed through tens of thousands of years ago. This is called sediment DNA, or CEDAS DNA, and for Denisovan research it's revolutionary. Here's the basic idea. Every time a human or an animal walks through a cave, they shed microscopic bits of themselves. Skin cells, hair fragments, droplets of blood, feces, urine, all of that leaks DNA into the soil. Most of it breaks down fast. But in the cold, dark, relatively stable world of a cave floor, some of those fragments get bound to tiny mineral particles and survive. If you scoop up a bit of that sediment and treat it right, you can filter out those ancient genetic crumbs. Then you amplify them, sequence them, and compare the sequences to reference genomes. If a chunk looks Neanderthal-like, you tag it. If it looks modern human-like, you tag it. And if it has that distinctive Denisovan signature, you just found Denisovans without finding a single bone. This has already happened. In several caves where no Denisovan fossils were known, sediment DNA has quietly revealed that Denisovan populations use those spaces at various times. The bones are gone, but their genetic shadow is still in the dust. That's a complete change of game. It means we're no longer limited to the tiny handful of sites where bones happen to preserve. Any cave deposit from the right time window can, in principle, be tested. Suddenly the map of possible Denisovan territory isn't just guesswork based on stone tools and vague anatomy. It can be grounded in direct genetic evidence, and sediment DNA is just one tool in a rapidly growing arsenal. In a lot of places, DNA is simply gone. Too hot, too wet, too old. Once you get past about 100,000 to 200,000 years in many climates, there's nothing left to sequence. For most of human evolution, especially in the tropics, DNA is a lost cause, but proteins are tougher. Enter paleoproteomics, the study of ancient proteins preserved in bones, teeth, and even calcified dental plaque. Proteins are made from amino acids, and the order of those amino acids is encoded by genes. Different species have slightly different protein sequences, so even when the DNA is shredded beyond recovery, some proteins can still carry a readable species fingerprint. With high-resolution mass spectrometers, researchers can grind up a tiny fraction of a fossil tooth, identify the surviving proteins, and match their sequences against known human and ape lineages. That's how some highly fragmentary remains from China, for example, have been reassessed as archaic human, but not clearly Neanderthal or modern. With better comparisons, including Denisovan sequences, those ambiguous fossils could be reassigned. That's the other quiet revolution. We now have genuine Denisovan DNA as a reference. Every time we sequence more Denisovan material, we refine the template. That template can then be used to screen older collections worldwide, not just for DNA but for proteins that smell Denisovan. You might have a jawbone in a museum drawer that was collected in the 1980s, labelled Archaic Homo Uncertain. You test a tiny chip of dentine, look at the proteins, and suddenly it lines up with the Denisovan profile. Instant smoking gun. No need to get lucky with a brand new fossil in the field. The evidence might already be waiting in storage. To make all this even more powerful, dating methods are getting sharper too. It used to be that a site might be dated to between 40,000 and 100,000 years ago, and everyone just shrugged. Now, combinations of techniques, radiocarbon, luminescence dating, uranium series, paleomagnetism, can tighten those windows dramatically. That matters for Denisovans because so many crucial questions are about overlap. Did Denisovans and modern humans actually use this valley at the same time, or were they separated by 20,000 years? Did Denisovans really hang on in this mountain range after Neanderthals were gone, or are we mixing up layers? When you can pin a layer down to, say, between 52,000 and 58,000 years ago, instead of somewhere in the last 100,000 years, you can start to say something meaningful about who met whom and when. Then there's the layer above all of this, computation. The data coming out of these methods, genomes, protein sequences, sediment profiles, artifact catalogues, is enormous. No single human brain can juggle all of it in detail. So researchers are turning to machine learning and other AI-assisted tools to look for patterns we'd miss. You can feed in thousands of stone tools from dozens of sites, each measured and described in obsessive detail. An algorithm can cluster them, not based on our pre-existing labels. This is Mousterian, this is Upper Paleolithic, but on subtle shape and production similarities. Maybe it finds that a group of tools from a site in Tibet clusters tightly with tools from a Siberian cave where we know Denisovans were, and not with neighbouring modern human sites. That doesn't prove who made them, but it raises a sharp, testable question. The same goes for genetics. Algorithms can scan modern genomes looking for segments that don't just look archaic, but specifically Denisovan-like, then model where and when those segments most likely entered modern populations. Different chunks might trace back to different Denisovan populations, Siberian-like, Southeast Asian-like, high-altitude adapted. That starts to sketch a picture of Denisovan diversity we've never seen in the bones. None of these tools, on their own, is magic. Sediment DNA doesn't tell you what tools were in someone's hands. Proteins don't show you the shape of a face. AI can't conjure data that isn't there. But together they make Denisovans visible from multiple angles at once. And that tells us where to look next. If you map where Denisovan ancestry is strongest in living people, and then overlay that with where caves, karst landscapes and ancient shorelines should be, you get a hit list of promising regions. High on that list is East Asia, especially China. Across northern and central China, there are dozens of archaic human fossils. Jaws, partial skulls, isolated teeth. Many were found before anyone had heard the word Denisovan. A few have been tentatively linked to Denisovans based on dental shape or age, but without direct genetic proof. Systematically testing these collections with proteomics and any recoverable DNA could suddenly turn vague, mystery humans into concrete Denisovan individuals. Then there's Southeast Asia. Places like Sulawesi, Borneo, the Philippines, and the now submerged Sunda Shelf that once linked many of these islands to the mainland. Modern populations there often carry high levels of Denisovan ancestry. We know other archaic humans like Homo floresiensis and Homo luzonensis lived on some of these islands, but we haven't yet nailed down where exactly Denisovans fit into that patchwork. Caves in limestone regions, karst systems, tend to preserve sediments and bones well. Many of those caves are barely surveyed, let alone fully excavated. A single layer with Denisovan sediment DNA correlating with a distinctive stone tool industry, or even a fragmentary bone, could anchor whole regions of ghost ancestry to a physical presence. The Himalayan plateau and surrounding highlands are another prime target. The Denisovan-like jaw from Siahi, on the Tibetan plateau, dated to about 160,000 years ago, was a hint. Someone with Denisovan affinities was living at serious altitude long before modern humans showed up there. Modern Tibetans still carry Denisovan-derived variants that help them breathe in thin air. Somewhere between those two facts is a whole story of adaptation, migration and survival that we've barely begun to tell. More caves in the plateau's rain-shadow valleys, more rock shelters along ancient river corridors. Those are likely to be treasure hunts for Denisovan traces. And of course, Siberia isn't done yet. Denisova Cave was basically an accident. A big, easy-to-access cave that happened to preserve an extraordinary time series of occupation layers. But the Altai region is riddled with other caves. So are the Ural Mountains and parts of Mongolia. Some have been dug, many haven't. Even in already excavated sites, resampling sediments and re-examining old collections with new methods has started to yield surprises. One tiny bone fragment turned out to belong to a first-generation Neanderthal-Denisovan hybrid. How many more odd fragments are waiting for the right test? All of this builds toward a particular kind of dream discovery, the one every researcher secretly hopes for, a Denisovan smoking gun. What would that look like? At minimum, it's a well-preserved skull, or better yet, a partial skeleton, cranium, jaw, bits of postcranial skeleton, the stuff that tells you about body shape, height, musculature, and how they moved. It would come from a layer we can date cleanly. Ideally, that same layer would contain a rich assemblage of tools, maybe ornaments, maybe evidence of fire use, food processing, even pigments or engravings. Then, in the lab, you extract DNA, or, failing that, proteins. The molecules line up clearly with the Denisovan profile. No, could be Neanderthal, could be something else. A solid match. Now we'd finally have what we still lack. A face to put to the ghost. A brain case we can measure. Teeth we can compare. Limb bones that tell us whether giant is hype or reality, and in what sense. We could say, this is how Denisovans differed anatomically from Neanderthals and modern humans. This is how they might have moved, breathed, given birth, healed from injuries. If that same site also had a distinctive tool tradition, or particular styles of ornamentation, we could begin to talk about a Denisovan material culture with far more confidence than we can today. Not just somebody used these tools in a region where Denisovans were probably around, but these tools and this body go together. Find a few such sites from different regions, Siberia, the Plateau, Southeast Asia, and you could start tracing regional Denisovan lineages, comparing their morphologies and their cultures, seeing how they adapted in different landscapes, how they changed over time. That's the level of detail we have for Neanderthals. Denisovans, for now, are still mostly a set of genetic signals and a handful of tantalizing fragments. But that imbalance is temporary. Every year, more sediment samples are tested, more old fossils are re-examined, more cave systems are mapped. AI tools get better at spotting patterns in noisy data. Dating methods chip away at the fog of time, and with each new Denisovan-linked fragment, each new trace of archaic DNA in unexpected places, the silhouette sharpens. The story of Denisovans is not a finished chapter in human evolution, neatly filed away. It's an active investigation, halfway between detective work and deep-time archaeology. The fossils we haven't found yet will almost certainly force us to rewrite parts of the story you've just heard. They might show that Denisovans were more diverse than we thought, more widespread, more inventive, or oddly specialized and regionally constrained. They might reveal that other currently invisible lineages mingled with them, adding new branches to an already tangled family tree. Somewhere in a cave roofed by ice, or a hillside of crumbling limestone, or a drawer in a small regional museum, the next Denisovan reveal is waiting. When it arrives, it won't just tell us about them. It will tell us again about us, about the hidden ancestors whose genes we carry, whose adaptations we still depend on, and whose full story is only just beginning to come into focus. The strange thing about Denisovans is that, in one sense, we've almost never seen them, and in another sense we see them every single day. On the fossil side, they're barely there. A fingertip, a few teeth, a jaw from a high plateau, some scattered fragments that could fit in a small box with room to spare. If all we had were the bones, Denisovans would be a footnote, a weird Siberian population, a curiosity. But then you zoom in, past the bones, into the level of molecules, and suddenly they're everywhere, in the DNA of indigenous Australians and Papuans, in the genomes of people in the Philippines, in mainland East Asia, in parts of South Asia, even in tiny traces across the rest of the world, in high-altitude adaptations in Tibetans, in subtle tweaks to immune systems, in how some bodies process fat, starch and oxygen. A species we can barely reconstruct as a face has quietly shaped how millions of people breathe, fight infections, maybe even how they respond to cold and hunger. That's the core puzzle of Denisovans. Almost no skeletons, almost no agreed-upon toolkit, no painted caves with their name on it, but a genetic fingerprint that runs like a faint watermark through vast stretches of humanity. They are a reminder that history is not just what survives in stone and bone, it's also what survives in blood. When you hear that someone today carries 3, 4, 5% Denisovan ancestry, that number can sound small. But those percentages come from real encounters, real people meeting on windswept plateaus, in forest valleys, along ancient shorelines. They hunted, ate, told stories, fell in love, buried their dead. Some of their children didn't make it. Some did. Enough did that. 50,000 years later, you can sit there and quietly carry their legacy inside your cells. Most of the time, we talk about Denisovans as they, a separate species, a ghost population. But genetically, there is no clean wall between them and us. There's a blur. Interbreeding, shared ancestors, branches of a tree reconnecting. Yes, Denisovans as a distinct culture and body form are gone. Their last independent communities probably disappeared tens of thousands of years ago, swallowed up by changing climates, shifting habitats, and the spread of other humans. But extinction, in this case, isn't a clean erasure. It's more like a merger. Part of why that feels so haunting is that they're both familiar and alien. Close enough that our ancestors had children together. Far enough that when we finally pulled their genome out of that tiny finger bone, it didn't match anything alive. That combination, near but lost, hits a very old nerve. Because Denisovans are not the only ones like this. Our whole story is full of vanished cousins, Neanderthals, hobbits from Flores, the tiny humans from Luzon, and probably others we haven't even named yet. Each one left a different kind of trace. Neanderthals gave us skulls and caves we can walk through. Denisovans gave us genes. And that's one more quiet lesson here. Our picture of the past is always skewed by what happens to preserve well. Cold caves remember better than tropical forests. Teeth remember better than soft tissue. DNA remembers better in some places than in others. When we talk about the human story, we're really talking about the parts of it that happen to fossilize or linger in genomes long enough for us to notice. Which raises a question I'd love to hear your thoughts on. After everything you've heard, what surprised you most about Denisovans? Was it how little bone we have, compared to how much genetic influence they left behind? Was it the idea of high-altitude Denisovans on the Tibetan plateau? Seafaring Denisovans island-hopping through Southeast Asia? Something else entirely? And if you had to guess, based on the clues from DNA, from caves, from modern populations, where do you think the real heartland of Denisovan life was? The frozen north around Denisova Cave? The misty karst of southern China? The islands and drowned plains of Southeast Asia? The Himalayas and their hidden valleys? Tell me where you're listening from right now, and what time it is there, and then add your best guess. Where do you think the biggest Denisovan city, or at least their most important cluster of camps, once stood? If you've enjoyed this deep dive into a people we mostly know from whispers in our genes, it genuinely helps if you like this video, leave a comment and subscribe. That tells the algorithms there's an audience for slow, strange stories about long-dead relatives who still live on in our bodies. And if this kind of thing really grabs you, bottlenecks, ghost species, lost landscapes, there's more waiting for you. I've put together a book about prehistoric secrets and deep time stories, written in this same slow, immersive style. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. If you like the feeling of falling asleep with your brain full of Ice Age campfires and vanished coastlines, you might enjoy it. For now, remember this. Even if you have zero Denisovan ancestry on paper, your story is still tangled up with theirs. Your lineage passed through the same bottleneck that shaped them. Your ancestors walked through the same climate disasters, the same narrow evolutionary corridors. Denisovans are one answer to the question, what can humans become under those pressures? Modern humans are another. We are not the only way this experiment could have turned out. We're just the version that happened to still be here, still wondering about the others. Somewhere in you, whether in a stretch of DNA or just in the shared history of our species, there are traces of those hidden ancestors. They breathed thin air, crossed strange seas, watched unfamiliar stars. They are gone, but they're also, quietly, still here. And the more we learn to read the code written in dust, in bone, and in our own genomes, the more clearly we'll see them looking back.